Committee will come to order. Let me welcome all the members, witnesses, and guests to the first formal hearing of this committee in the 114th Congress. Before we turn to our witnesses and the topic of the day, Mr. Smith and I want to take a brief moment to welcome and to introduce the new members of the committee. The brevity of our introductions is no indication of the talent that the new members bring. It's simply a function of our time limitations. We're going to have votes here in a little bit. But I do want to take a moment to welcome our new folks. On the Republican side, there are 6 new members, starting with Sam Graves, who represents the Missouri 6th District and is joining us after completing his term as the chairman of the House Small Business Committee. He has worked with us on those issues before and will be a huge asset as we continue to work through a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. Next is Ryan Zinke, who represents Montana's at-large district, a 23-year-old veteran of the Navy and former Navy SEAL commander with combat tours in Iraq. So he brings lots of experience, but I'm told his most important role is that of a proud Navy dad, which we all understand. Elise Stefanik is representing New York's 21st District in Fort Drum, home of the 10th Mountain Division. The youngest woman ever elected to the House. She also knows her way around Washington, having served in the Bush White House and at the Foreign Policy Institute. Martha McSally represents the 2nd District of Arizona, home of Fort Huachuca and Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. She's a retired Air Force colonel, a combat aviator, and the first woman to command an A-10 squadron. And flew multiple missions in Iraq. Steve Knight represents California's 25th Congressional District. Born in Edwards Air Force Base, he has served in the Army, also as a Los Angeles police officer and as a state senator. He has a wealth of knowledge on the rich aviation tradition of that district, which we will take advantage of. And finally, Tom MacArthur represents Southern New Jersey's 3rd District, home of Joint Base McGuire-Dix, a former mayor of Randolph, New Jersey. Tom has over 30 years business experience in the insurance industry, and we certainly look forward to putting those skills to work here at the Armed Services Committee. So let me welcome the 6 new members on our side and yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have actually 9 new members on our side of the aisle. I want to welcome them. We have 2 who are veterans of the Congress joining the committee, and then 7 new members. Tim Walz is our first member from Minnesota. He is currently serving his 4th term representing Minnesota's 1st Congressional District. He enlisted in the Army National Guard at the age of 17 and retired 24 years later as a Command Sergeant Major and has done a ton of work on veterans issues. Served on that committee previously, and we've worked closely together. Beto O'Rourke is from Texas. He was elected to represent the people of the 16th District of Texas in November of 2012. Prior to his congressional service, Beto O'Rourke served 2 terms in the El Paso City Council and represents Fort Bliss in El Paso. Donald Norcross from New Jersey was sworn in to the 113th Congress to represent New Jersey's 1st Congressional District. He previously served in both the New Jersey General Assembly and State Senate, where he developed a reputation as an effective bipartisan reformer. Those are, 2 words, bipartisan and reformer, that will fit well in this committee. So welcome. I think some of our other members are not here, but I'll go ahead and introduce them in absentia anyway. Ruben Gallego of Arizona is the son of Hispanic immigrants, a veteran and a community leader. He was the first in his family to attend college and later joined the Marine Corps, serving in Iraq with the well-known combat unit Lima 325. Mark Takai of Hawaii was elected to Hawaii's 1st Congressional District, which was vacated when Colleen Hanabusa decided to run for the United States Senate. He serves in the Hawaii Army National Guard as a lieutenant colonel and took part in Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2009. Gwen Graham represents Florida's 2nd Congressional District. She's the daughter of Bob Graham, former United States Senator and Governor. She worked for her local school district and is also proud to represent Kendall Air Force Base in the 2nd Congressional District. Brad Ashford of Nebraska represents Nebraska's 2nd District, and from 87 to 95, he was a judge in the Nebraska Court of Industrial Relations and then served in the state Senate until he was elected to Congress. Seth Moulton of Massachusetts represents Massachusetts' 6th Congressional District, graduated from Harvard in 2001 with a Bachelor of Science in Physics. He joined the United States Marine Corps, served 4 tours in the Iraq War, and between those tours earned his master's degrees in business and public administration and a dual program at Harvard University. And last is Pete Aguilar, who represents California's 31st District, and from 2010 to 2015, he served as the mayor of the city of Redlands. Prior to that, he was the youngest member ever to serve in the Redlands City Council 140-year history. So we have a lot of new members. Welcome to the committee. Look forward to working with all of you. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to just say again how much I appreciate the talent, the experience, and the dedication that all the new members on both sides of the aisle bring to this committee. We're going to be, I can already tell, you're going to enhance our deliberations and decisions, and I'm really glad to have you all here. It is also true there were many more members who wanted to be on this committee than we had room for, and but we definitely got the cream of the crop. Let's turn now to the subject of our hearing today. The subject is technological superiority, how the U.S. is doing, and how we can ensure that we have the technological edge we need for the years to come. And I would ask unanimous consent that my full opening statement be made part of the record. Without objection, so ordered. I'd just say the Constitution puts on the Congress the responsibility to provide and maintain, to raise and support military forces that can defend the country. And as we try to do that in this day and time, we have a number of challenges, one of which is that we face more different kind of challenges than maybe we ever have before. Another is that technology is moving incredibly quickly. And a third is that some potential adversaries or competitors are putting a lot of time, effort, and money into creating vulnerabilities for us. And then another challenge can be our own system. And so that's part of the reason I think it's important for us to look, as we have been this week, at what's happening in the world and then look at what we can do to improve things. And that's part of the reason defense reform is going to be a significant part of our agenda. So I really appreciate the witnesses we have today, Undersecretary of Defense Frank Kendall, who is leading the department's efforts in a number of respects in this topic, and also General Ramsey, who's the Joint Staff Director for Force Structure, Resources, and Assessment. It just seems to me the key question before us is what should we in Congress do to ensure that America has the technological superiority we require so that we meet the nation's needs and the demands of our time. I'd yield to Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this very important committee. I welcome Mr. Kendall and General Ramsey, and this is an incredibly important topic. Acquisition reform has always been a challenge at the Department of Defense. We're always seeking ways to improve it, but I think it's particularly important in the environment that we find ourselves in, which combines 2 unfortunate elements. One, an expanding and very confusing threat environment. We cannot say that things are getting less threatening or we have fewer national security challenges in the world. It's going in the opposite direction, and at the same time, they are incredibly complex. And that is combined, of course, with a shrinking budget and the challenges of sequestration and the challenges of the reductions in the budget, and also, I might add, the challenges of the government shutdown, the CRs. Basically, from one month to the next, you have frequently over the course of the last 4 years not known how much money you are going to have to spend or where. So in that type of environment, the better we spend that money, the better off we're going to be. So I know this is something that's been a huge priority for Mr. Kendall since he joined the Department of Defense, figuring out ways to buy equipment more quickly, more efficiently, make sure we get more out of it, because we have a history of over the last decade that is not pretty when it comes to a lot of money being spent in ways that did not turn out well. wasted money on a variety of different programs. I want to particularly thank Mr. Thornberry for his leadership on this issue. It's something he's worked on for a long time on the committee. I think he understands it better than anybody and is perfectly positioned to lead the effort to try to reform our acquisition process. And with that, I look forward to the witness's testimony and the questions and answers from the panel. I yield back.
Great. I thank the gentleman. Again, Mr. Kendall, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee. I'd like to begin by thanking the committee for its willingness to work with the Defense Department on ways to improve the productivity and effectiveness of defense acquisition. I requested my written statement and the accompanying materials, which provide details on our acquisition improvement efforts, be admitted to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
The acquisition improvement initiatives that the Department undertook beginning in 2010, when Dr. Carter was Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and I was his principal deputy, initiatives that we called Better Buying Power have evolved as we have learned from our experience and gathered data on the effectiveness of our policies. We are currently close to issuing guidance implementing what we call Better Buying Power 3.0, released last year in draft. 3.0 builds upon core aspects of earlier versions that emphasize strong performance incentives, competition, and professionalism in our acquisition workforce, and close and continuous interaction of acquisition and requirements community, which is represented here today by General Ramsey, the J8 from the Joint Staff. Better Buying Power also emphasizes elimination of unproductive bureaucracy. The rules our program managers must follow are still too complicated and burdensome. I know the committee leadership shares this view, and I'm happy to say that the administration will soon formally submit several legislative proposals designed to address this problem to both the House and the Senate Armed Services Committees. I'm providing those proposals informally to the committee today. The Department looks forward to working with the committee on these proposals. Better Buying Power 3.0 continues the core aspects of earlier versions, but shifts our focus towards technical excellence and innovation. It's a response to the technological superiority concerns that the chairman mentioned. We provided the members with a one-page summary, which you should have in front of you. As I've testified to before this committee previously, I am very concerned about the increasing risk of loss of U.S. military technological superiority. I was also recently asked to provide an input to the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee on areas in which the Congress could help the Department improve acquisition outcomes. And I'd like to summarize my submission for this committee. Number one, and number one by a very wide margin, end the threat of sequestration. As the leadership mentioned, this is a huge problem for the Department. The uncertainty associated with our ability to plan without knowing what our future budgets will be with any confidence, and the inadequate resources that sequestration levels would provide are enormous problems for the Department. Number two, continue to support the Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund. This fund is a valuable tool for improving the professionalism of the acquisition workforce. Number three, work with the Department to simplify the rules we already have. As the Chairman, Ranking Member, and I have discussed previously, we can eliminate a great deal of unproductive overhead and confusion by simplifying the rules governing acquisition today. The recommendations we're providing to the committee go a long way in that direction, and I hope we'll be able to implement those. Number four, avoid highly restrictive rules that limit Department freedom of action. The Department implements an almost infinitely varied set of business arrangements with industry, and we need the flexibility to tailor our contracts consistent with all the various types of situations that we face. We cover a very wide set of different options. Number five, reduce the counterproductive incentive to obligate funds on a fixed schedule. In any negotiation, time is a factor that works to one side's advantage. Rigid time-based obligation requirements automatically work against the Department in our negotiations. Number six, allow the Department to hold a management reserve to apply to programs that realize risks. Under current practice, programs that are performing well often have to be the sources of funds to repair poorly performing programs. Number seven, and I would use this as the other bookmark, if you will, to this set of inputs. Help the Department improve the professionalism of the government workforce. I believe this area has the greatest potential over the long term of improving acquisition outcomes. I have worked on and led some well-led and some not so well-led programs in industry and in government. Leadership and professional skills honed over decades do matter, perhaps more than any other factor that we can influence. Again, I'd like to thank the committee for its cooperation and support. Our warfighters and taxpayers deserve the best performance we can possibly achieve from the acquisition system. I know you're all equally committed to that goal. Thank you.
Thank you. General Ramsey, do you have an oral statement you'd like to give, or?
I do, Mr. Chairman. And if I could also request that my written statement be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. As the Director for Force Structure, Resources, and Assessments, I provided insights in my written statement into the Joint Staff's role in requirements generation and capabilities development process, specifically highlighting the close interaction and linkages between requirements and other department process to include the Defense Acquisition System that Mr. Kendall oversees. The Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC, is charged to identify, assess, and prioritize military capability needs, and the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, or JCIDS, is the process that enables the JROC to meet our statutory responsibilities. I want to thank the work of this committee, as well as the Senate Armed Services Committee, for providing reforms in recent years that added emphasis on our analysis of risk, cost, and schedule very early in program development, established a deliberate, urgent, and emergent requirements lanes to better respond to our warfighter operational user needs, and to enable us to consolidate guidance documents, streamline our procedures, and mandate shorter document length and staffing timelines. These reforms also shaped the JROC into a lean decision-making body chaired by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with the Service Vice Chiefs and Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps serving as the statutory members. The combatant commanders also participate based on interest in each program. Statutory advisors include Mr. Kendall, as well as the Undersecretaries of Defense for Policy and the Comptroller, the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, and the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. In the execution of the JROC's duties, we work very closely with all stakeholders to manage an agile and responsive requirements process that's intertwined with other key decision processes across the Department of Defense. Our ultimate goal in the JCID process is to ensure that we remain agile and responsive and innovative so the Department can develop and deliver operationally and cost-effective capabilities to the Joint Force to help her achieve our nation's strategic and military objectives. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And let me just say, I very much appreciate the working relationship that we have had over the past year or so, Mr. Kendall, with you and your team, but also Mr. Smith. He has been integral to everything we've tried to work on. This has been completely bipartisan, as well as working with the Pentagon, as well as working with the Senate. And I think all of us recognize that it's going to take all of us collaborating, working together to improve this system. Because it very much is like changing an airplane engine while the engine's in flight. We still have to defend the country while we look to make improvements. So, and I particularly appreciate, Mr. Kendall, you sending up legislative proposals ahead of the budget. I think that is something that's unusual. I think it shows the seriousness with which at least you and the folks at the Pentagon take this issue. So thank you. That helps us get a head start. The one question I want to pose to you is this. As you know, we've had some classified and unclassified sessions for members this week about where are we? Technological superiority, are we ahead, how much, are we losing it? Just kind of the state of technology, especially again versus near-peer type competitors. We obviously can't talk specifics in an open session, but I'm just wondering how you would characterize where we are and what concerns you for the American people. Kind of in layman's language, where do you think we are as far as the country's technological superiority and what concerns you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're at risk, and the situation is getting worse. I came back to the Pentagon in 2010 after being away for about 15 years. And the intelligence estimates when I left in 1994 were that China was really not much of a problem for us, but in 10 or 15 years they possibly could be. based on their economic rate of growth at that time. I came back, and the intelligence estimates were correct. And I became, I think it's fair to say, alarmed as soon as I started seeing technical intelligence reports on China's modernization programs. And I could say the same of Russia's modernization programs as well. We came out of the Cold War with a very dominant military. We demonstrated that military conclusively in the first Gulf War, and we've used it very effectively against any conventional force in the period since. Since 2001, we've been involved in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism campaigns, which are a very different kind of threat. No one observed more carefully the dominance that we demonstrated in 1991 than the Chinese. And we demonstrated what Bob Work calls the second offset strategy, which is the capability of precision munitions in particular, but also stealth, networked forces, and wide area surveillance, as technologies which in an integrated fashion gave a very dominant capability to our forces. People have had a long time. That was a long time ago. People have had quite a bit of time to think about and to do things about how to defeat that force. And what I'm seeing in foreign modernizations, again, particularly China's, is a suite of capabilities that are intended, clearly to me at least, to defeat the American way of doing power projection, American way of warfare, when we fight in an expeditionary manner far from the United States. Our systems depend upon what I would call a few high-value assets. And it would start with space-based assets, satellites, which in relatively small numbers provide important functions for intelligence, targeting, and communications. And I would include aircraft carriers, which are the basis for our naval power projection, which we have a small number, and airfields, which are the basis by which the Air Force is able to project power using mostly fighter aircraft. Those targets that those represent to an adversary are finite. They're there in limited numbers. And the precision munitions revolution that we demonstrated has been emulated by others. So if I were to worry about one aspect of the threat, I would start by talking about missiles, both ballistic and cruise missiles that can attack those high-value assets. I was an Army air defender years ago, and our best air defense systems could get maybe a 70% probability of kill. If you were good, maybe a 90% probability of kill against one incoming airplane or missile. It doesn't take much to do the math to figure out that if you send a large number of missiles against a single asset, that you are going to get some through. And once those missiles become highly accurate and can kill the thing that you're trying to attack if they penetrate, then you have a problem. That's the change that has occurred. And we pioneered that change, but it's now been emulated by others. And without saying too much about this, the Chinese in particular, and again, to a lesser extent the Russians, are going beyond what we have done. They are making advances beyond what we currently have fielded. And it's designed to threaten largely those various high-value assets. Now, the department is recognizing this. Dr. Carter, whose hearing will be next week, I think, and I have talked about this briefly. He understands it. Bob Work understands it. Secretary Hagel understands it. So we have been doing some things to try to address this problem. But we also have global commitments. We also have readiness concerns. And we also have the threat of sequestration in front of us. So this is a serious problem for the country. And I gave a testimony here last year where I talked about the U.S. being challenged at an unprecedented rate. It's not just missiles. It's other things such as electronic warfare capabilities. It's anti-satellite capabilities, a spectrum of things to defeat our space systems. It's a number of things which I think are being developed very consciously to defeat the American way of projecting power. And we need to respond to that.
Well, thank you. I just think it's important to emphasize the need to improve our acquisition process is not just about saving money. It's about this problem of change that is going faster and faster that we're having trouble keeping up with. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one straightforward question on acquisition reform. A lot of it is what goes on within the Pentagon, the culture, the decisions that are made, all kinds of different structure. But from a legislative standpoint, as we here get ready to try to put together an acquisition reform package, what authority don't you have that you would like to have? What changes in the law can we give you that would give you the flexibility to do some of the things that you and Mr. Thornberry just talked about?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Congressman Smith, I generally have the authorities that I need. I don't think our problem is authorities. I think our problem has more to do with implementation of the things that we have. And that is why I emphasize professionalism in our workforce so much. We need to give our people the tools and the training and the experience they need to do their jobs well. And then we need to get out of their way a lot of the things that make it harder for them to do their jobs. I spoke to Navy Admiral Dave Lewis a couple of years ago, He's a PEO, Program Executive Officer of the Navy. And he told me that he was most effective as a program manager when he was running the DDG-51 destroyer program, when he had a multi-year contract, because he could focus entirely on managing that contract and managing the performance of industry to do a better job of delivering product to the Navy. And what was different, of course, in the multi-year contract environment that he was in, was he didn't have to come in for repeated staff reviews all of the time that took up all of his time and distracted him from actually doing his job. I took that to heart, and I think we really need to work hard to relieve some of the burdens that we're imposing on our program managers and our acquisition workforce. They're well-intentioned, and a lot of the recommendations that we've prepared and brought over to the committee go along those lines. They relieve some of the burdens that are on our people. Developing the professionalism of the workforce is a task that takes time. You know, I want to compliment our workforce. We have, I think, an exceptionally capable and professional workforce, but it can be improved. We have a workforce where the demographics are a little troubling. We have a lot of people close to retirement and a lot of young people that just came in kind of a bathtub in the middle. We have to manage our way through that. So we need tools to build up that workforce and make it more capable over time. And we'd like the help of the committee on that in particular.
Yeah, one of the complaints that we hear we hear all the time from industry in terms of specifically going over budget on projects is the amount of overseers, regulators that they have to deal with on a day in and day out basis, that drives a lot of their cost. I've talked to a lot of people about this in the think tank world, and they say, you know, true or not, live with it because it's not changing. But it seems to me like if it's something that's that big a problem, we ought to focus on. And their argument is they spend more time trying to justify every decision they're making than actually doing their work. Do you see this as a problem? Are there too many bureaucrats, you know, overseeing the making of our military equipment in a duplicative fashion that's not actually helping?
The short answer is no, but I think we can improve in that regard. We've been working for the last few years with our department's auditors, who don't report directly to me, but have worked with me very closely on this. There's a very large backlog of audits that needs to be done that basically is a problem for us. There is a problem with using statistical audits as opposed to complete audits and finding ways to be more effective in how we focus the resources that we have. The Defense Contract Management Organization that does report to me supervises our contractors, and I think we have to strike a balance there. I don't think we're vastly off on that. I don't think that's a core problem for us. We recover quite a bit of money through our auditing process each year, much more than the auditing cost us. We do find quality problems, and you'll read reports about those occasionally in the press. And so we do have to have some level of that. I don't think our balance is all that far off, but I do think we can improve.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here today. General Ramsey, the acquisition workforce is actively managed, including providing a number of incentives and career path opportunities. How does that compare with the requirements workforce? Do you have any recommendations for improving the career management of the requirements workforce?
Thank you, Congressman Wilson. Thanks to the work of this committee, about, I think it was 2007, there was statutory requirement, just as the acquisition workforce, for a requirements workforce that was more professional. So we now have a 5-level certification program required for all the folks who touch requirements, whether they're military or civilian, to go through Defense Acquisition University. One of those programs is for senior leader requirements. I went through that program 2.5 years ago when I took that job. So we think we've got a very robust program that goes back now. We implemented this starting in the beginning of fiscal year 08. So the workforce we have in place is they're a professional workforce. They obviously rotate out probably more than the acquisition managers do, because many of these folks are wearing uniform like I am. But the folks that come into this process have various certification requirements. So the short answer is I think we're right where we need to be, and we're getting better with time.
That's encouraging. And Mr. Kendall, thank you for raising concerns about threats to our country. And we're not just talking about money. We're talking about being technologically ahead to protect the American people. And thank you for raising that. Additionally, we do see that the Small Business Innovative Research Program as an important tool of the department to tap into vital innovative technologies from small businesses. What actions can the department take to improve the utilization of the program, especially the use of Phase 3s integrated into a larger acquisition program of record?
A good question, Congressman. We're looking at that program. It's been a very successful program. We get pretty good transition rates, but there are some issues with it. The amount of time it takes to get an award and getting from one phase to the other and then getting into where you're actually producing things has been a problem historically. We're looking at, if you look at the sheet of paper you have in front of you, under Better Buying Power 3.0, we are looking at all of the different categories of research and development spending that we have. And I have teams working those right now, including things like Small Business Innovative Research and the Rapid Innovation Fund, for example, and our other areas of contracted R&D, as well as independent R&D that industry does. We need to try to get as much as we can out of each of those individual pots of money, if you will. So we're looking at that hard now, and we'll be coming back with some recommendations in the next few months on that.
Well, a good program, and however we can improve it, we appreciate that. In meeting with service acquisition executives earlier this week, they recommended spending more time at the front end of a program, such as thorough market research, modeling, and simulation for trade space analysis, developmental planning, and technology maturation. They described a process where more time would be spent early in the process, but which would save time overall. Do you support that recommendation? What recommendations do you have to make the process to do a better job?
I do agree with that. I think it's very important that we take the time up front to make sure we've got it right, particularly in a time of scarce resources, as we cannot afford new starts that are false starts. When we start a program, we should be reasonably confident that we're going to take it through to completion and field the capability. And doing the system engineering up front, doing the requirements trade-offs up front, making sure the program is affordable, these are all very, very important. Making sure the business strategy and the risk mitigation plans are appropriate is incredibly important. So I agree with that comment. It's one of the things we're trying to do.
And you've already referenced this, but it's so important on page 3 of your testimony, quote, Russia and others such as Iran are also fielding precision missiles and other capabilities that threaten our power projection capabilities, end of quote. I think, again, if you could restate your concerns, the American people need to know this.
The concern is that we're dependent upon a very small number of what I call high-value assets to implement conventional military power, generally far from the shores of the United States. And as you get closer to someone else's homeland, their ability, they have certain advantages at that point. They have, obviously, land basing for their systems. They can have mobile systems that are hard for us to target. We have a small number of assets which are carrying the bulk of our power projection capability forward. They're either Air Force bases that are already in the region, or they're carriers and carrier strike groups that are coming forward. And if you can target those and attack them with precision missiles, then you have a significant advantage. That's the situation that we're increasingly facing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the witnesses. Last Saturday, one of the drumbeat of snowstorms up in New England, all my events were canceled, and I finally got a chance to sit down and watch the PBS special on Hyman Rickover, which, again, I would encourage all members to review, because it really is squarely in the sweet spot of what we're talking about here today. And he obviously was an innovator and a maverick. That's almost an understatement. He obviously, the movie, this documentary is more about almost his struggles with the bureaucracy than it was with the technology of building nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines. And two of your initiatives are focused on innovation. One is the DARPA initiative, and then is the acquisition reform. And I was trying to visualize reading that, how Hyman Rickover, who I think is still provided us with undersea dominance based on what he did 60 years ago, you know, would function today, and sort of how you see that is sort of trying to nurture that kind of amazing creativity that will help us with this technological gap that we're facing.
Rickover established a lasting culture and tradition in the Navy, and nuclear power Navy, which I think everyone should admire. It's a terrific organization. He was also very much a person who was a very strong engineering background, very strong leadership model. I think we can emulate a lot of that, and we should be. And I talk about developing professionals. He's the sort of person that I have in mind. Everybody can't be a maverick, obviously, but you do have to. I find myself constantly trying to beat back the bureaucracy, which has a tendency. If you've looked at any of the literature on bureaucracies and how they grow, there are certain rules for how bureaucracies sort of self-perpetuate and increase their size over time. And it's just a constant struggle to push back on that and to try to make sure that people focus on substance as opposed to form in the things that we do. It's one of the reasons we're asking for some of the legislative reforms that we're asking for, to try to get rid of some of those bureaucratic tools and replace some things that are more substantive. So I generally agree with your point about that, and it's consistent with my point about professionalism and the importance of leadership.
So can you talk about the DARPA piece of your proposal in terms of where that creates that space?
Yeah,
for
I
that
think
to-
you're referring to what we call the Aerospace Innovation Initiative. Yeah, this will be in our budget, and I've been authorized to talk about this a little bit, even though the budget's not out yet. The Aerospace Innovation Initiative is consistent with one of the Better Buying Power 3.0 initiatives on prototyping and experimentation. And what it will be is a program that will be initially led by DARPA, but it'll involve the Navy and the Air Force as well. And the intent is to develop prototypes for the next generation of air dominance platforms, X-plane programs, if you will. Be competitive. The Navy and the Air Force will each have a variant that's focused on their mission requirements. There'll be a technology period leading up to the development of the prototypes. And it'll be consistent with what we talked about earlier, where do the upfront work to make sure you're doing the right thing, but then reduce the lead time to having the next generation capabilities. So this is this will lead to the systems that will ultimately come after the F-35, essentially. Part of the program is an airframe-oriented program with those X-plane prototypes. Part of what we put under the Aerospace Innovation Initiative is a jet engine development program for the next generation, also competitive prototypes for the next generation of propulsion. Now, those are going to be two core parts of getting to the next generation of air dominance. There are other elements of the department's program that are laid out that get to other aspects, but that's what the Aerospace Innovation Initiative is. Thanks for asking about it. I think it's an important initiative. It falls under a broader Defense Innovation Initiative that Secretary Hagel announced last fall, which covers our business processes, operational concepts, the way we train people, and a number of other things. But it's consistent with that approach.
Thank you. Again, the sort of fun fact in that documentary was that it took 5 years from the moment we had atomic-powered light bulb to the launching of the Nautilus as a nuclear-powered submarine, which is just, it's hard to even imagine. The Navy was telling him it was going to take 50 to 60 years to develop a nuclear-powered submarine, and he did it in really less than 5 years.
If I can respond to that, I've been asked by not too long ago by a reporter if I thought the department was taking too much risk. I think we're not taking enough risk. And one of the things that Rick Over did in that program was he did it in a managed, professional way. But we can't expect our programs to execute perfectly. If we're going to be the #1 country in the world militarily, we have to do things no one has ever done before. And that inherently involves risk. We can't, if we take the time to reduce every risk to zero, we'll never get there. We've got to be willing to accept risk in our programs and then deal with the fact that because of that, some of our development programs are going to have overruns and schedule slips. It's a part of the process. It's a part of the development process. So expecting perfection is really the wrong way for us to be thinking about development.
I appreciate that exchange. Risk and leadership, two keys to this whole thing. That was very, very interesting. Mr. Nugent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our two panelists today. Always great to hear from you. I think you usually do it in a way that we can understand, which is a good thing. This is really a two-part question, and it's for both Mr. Kendall and General Ramsey. What are the lessons learned from the department's rapid acquisition program, and what extent can those lessons be applied to accelerate other DOD acquisitions? And the second part of that question is, from a warfighter's perspective, are they connected well enough to allow to get the needs that they have to get actually an acquisition? And then when it gets to acquisition, a lot of times, we're trying to get to 100% perfect. I think you touched on it. When 80% or 90%, at least to get it out to the warfighter's hands, would be appropriate.
And as one of the things that we've seen with DOD acquisition is they do a really good job when you start building incrementally onto a program. And when you try to get to 100%, that just stalls programs, I think. And so it's really a two-part question. I'd love to hear your answer.
I think like a lot of other things, the secret is to have the right balance. The rapid acquisition programs, I think, have been very successful. And I look at MRAPs, for example, as a classic example there. And what we have done there is focus on the essentials of what we're trying to provide to the warfighter and go for that and get that done as quickly as possible. So we have accepted risk in those programs. And we haven't done perfect programs, but we've done programs that worked and saved lives, and we're very effective on the battlefield. I chair a group now called the Warfighter Senior Integration Group, which is in very close touch with our people doing operations. Response to what we call urgent operational needs. And we use rapid acquisition approaches to address those needs. So where they're applicable, they work very well. I'm going to just to be on the other hand, okay, there are programs where that isn't the right way to go about it.
Correct.
And I can think of some programs where we have done rapid acquisition type demonstrators, prototypes, and then tried to take them into production and field them without having done the things you need to make sure those are reliable and will really work in the environment over a period of time. So that's a little different than when you're trying to fight a warfighter and do something right now with one specific environment. So again, the secret is balance. But the programs you cite, I think, have been very effective. And one of the things we're trying to do is preserve that capability. As our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan have drawn down, we try to find ways to institutionalize that rapid acquisition approach. I published just recently our DOD 5000.02 instruction, which is our guidebook for all defense acquisition, basically. It's kind of the Bible for defense acquisition. And we included a rapid acquisition model in there, and a couple of approaches where urgency is really what drives you. And there you cut corners, you take risks, you do things you wouldn't do otherwise, you cut away the non-essential requirements, focus on the essential ones, and try to get the capability out as quickly as possible. So I appreciate your comment. That has been an effective program, and when it's appropriate, we want to continue to do it.
Councilman Nugent, I'll just piggyback on Mr. Kendall's comments by saying from my 2.5 years' experience, the authority and the guidance that this committee gave us back in NDA 2011 has been absolutely wonderful to support the warfighter. I would offer kind of two vignettes to answer both your questions. We are really good at adapting programs we have, and we're really good at delivering those things that truly are in a very short amount of time. So MRAP, Mr. Kendall used that example. Let me give you an example of both of those. Obviously, one of the biggest areas that we've been addressing for the past decade is the area of permissive ISR. So the MQ-1, MQ-9 platform, the Reaper being the MQ-9. One of the things we figured out was they're not an inexpensive aircraft. They're a phenomenal capability, and everybody wants them. The warfighters want them. So sometimes the solution is not more of the same. Sometimes it's modify what you have. So one of the things we've done through the rapid acquisition process is adding extended range kits to the MQ-9s we have. We continue to buy more of those. So eventually the fleet will be MQ-9, more capable platform, made even more capable through the joint, this rapid acquisition process. The second thing I will offer is when you take something that is developable in a short amount of time for the warfighter, we can do that very fast. So a great example just in the last few months has been with the Ebola crisis in West Africa. One of the things we were asked to do by the government was to come up with a way to transport our own people, to isolate them, the way you see a commercial company out of Atlanta, they do that now. We went from I need something to funding it, finishing the requirements, developing it, and fielding it in about 3 months, and that's the transportable isolation system. So where it's doable and manageable in a very short amount of time, we can deliver that very fast through the process. And as Mr. Kendall says, we can cut through a lot of red tape.
Well, I thank both of you for your answers, and I yield back.
Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. It comes at an important time, as you've outlined. These threats are expanding, they're new, and they're essentially technological. And yet, one of the biggest problems we have here in procurement is harnessing the powers of our own technology to get that into to get the innovation that's happening here in the United States into the military. And so this is not just an issue of management budget, but it's an issue of security. And it's my observation that we really just can't have this friction among these moving parts anymore. I'd offer some comments I've heard from industry, on which we rely to build and in many cases develop these products, that they don't have a good relationship in terms of interaction, and that they weren't involved necessarily in the better buying power programs development as much as they would want. I just encourage you to be talking to those folks about what it is we're missing, you're missing, and how that program can be improved. Obviously, there's issues of culture at any bureaucracy in the DOD, and I think you've identified some of those. And with respect to Congress, I do agree that with the recommendation that we repeal sequester, and if there's a vote on that, you'd have my support and my vote. I wanted to ask a specific question in the context of IT. Well, there's a major transformation with the ever-growing cloud, mobile, social computing requirements, and the acquisition of network equipment that has to fundamentally change if we're going to keep pace. And you, in August 2014, to your credit, your office released a set of competition guidelines, called out restrictive specifications as an impediment to competition, acquisition workforce complacency, lack of accountability and the use of sole source justifications, and cautionary language about vendor lock, offer general techniques and approaches to support competition, and a discussion on the benefits of employing an open systems architecture. All to your credit. I wanted to ask you two questions. One is, how would you characterize your implementation of those guidelines to date, specifically with respect to IT acquisition? And then what are some specific timelines and actions for implementing these good recommendations that you'd like to propose to promote competition?
There are two different forms of IT, I think, that we have to talk about. One is IT infrastructure, which is basically all the hardware and software that provides the networks that our applications run on. The other is the business systems that run on those networks, the applications, if you will. Working closely with the CIO on the infrastructure, which is largely his responsibility. And we have some good modernization programs, I think, in effect there, which will be much more efficient. On the business systems side, we're trying to get to a more flexible model. For a long time, the department was applying a model which was somewhat rigid in terms of how we wanted to see programs structured. And we're trying to learn from commercial industry more about how to do that. Now, I can tell you from my own commercial experience that implementing new business systems is very, very difficult, even in the commercial side of the house. Trying to do business systems at a major defense contractor I found to be a very, very challenging task. And there are a lot of histories of people having problems with that. The department has its own sordid history, I think, in business systems. And I think we have improved there. I think we have a long way to go. One of the things that I'm trying to do is build up our body of professionalism in that area. It's a very specialized acquisition field. It's not the same as a weapon system. The transition from an old business system to a new business system is much more difficult than the transition from an old piece of hardware to a new piece of hardware. The way you manage industry in that, the way you set up incentives, the way you ensure you have open systems so that you have flexibility and aren't in a vendor lock situation, they're all important in how we structure that. So I think we're making progress. It's hard to put out specific goals because we tend to work on a program-by-program basis. I'm trying to establish a center of excellence for business systems, which I think will be helpful to the department, essentially an internal consulting organization of people who have had experience implementing business systems. And one of the hardest things is transitioning them into a field and replacing the things that are already there, getting the workforce trained and so on. Another thing is tailoring our requirements.
So, I was just going to say about timelines. I'm running out of time here myself, so I wanted to see if you could give me some sense of how quickly you saw some progress in this transition.
We're doing, well, one that I think we have really turned the corner on and are doing much better on, although I don't want to jinx it, is electronic healthcare records, which we have moved to a more commercial model on. We're in source selection for that now. I've got a top management team working that. I think we're going to do a pretty good job with this one, make it a good model for how to do this. Others, I think we've learned from our mistakes. Some of our ERP, our enterprise resource programs, I think, are coming along and doing better. We had a financial management system in the Army which struggled a little bit to be put into the field last year that is doing all right now. So I think what I would have to do is look at the specific things we're doing and where you would see evidence through those of progress, as opposed to a
my time's
broad,
expired, but maybe if you could get back to me specifically on IT acquisition in writing, that would be helpful.
Happy to do that.
As y'all know, they have just called votes, excuse me, 2 votes. My intention is to go, say, another 10 minutes or so, and then recess to go vote, and then I'm going to come back and continue the hearing with the indulgence of our witnesses. Y'all can have a cup of coffee or something if you don't mind, and then we'll be back after that. Mr. Bridenstine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Kendall, thank you for being here, and General Ramsey, thank you. My question was for you, Mr. Kendall. You mentioned 3 high-value assets specifically. You talked about Air Force bases, you talked about aircraft carriers, and you talked about space. And that these high-value assets represent a relatively limited number of targets that enable the enemies of our country ultimately to have an advantage when we're on the other side of the world. And certainly that's a concern of mine as well. What I'd like to talk to you specifically about is space. When you think about architectures in space, we currently have in space from the commercial sector literally hundreds of satellites for communications. And if we were to leverage those satellites, we would in essence very quickly disaggregate the targeting solutions for our enemies, and at the same time create more resiliency and redundancy in space. Additionally, when you look at current acquisitions of, say, WGS satellites and the capabilities of these satellites, we're talking about the ability to transmit 7 gigabits per second compared to what the private sector is putting into space right now, which is 140 gigabits per second, and that's this year. Next year, we're going to be multiple hundreds of gigabits per second that the private sector is developing and launching. And at the same time, we're going to continue launching into the future owned and operated by the military satellites that only can produce 7 gigabits per second. My question for you is, when you look at disaggregation and resiliency, when you look at the capabilities of the private sector and you compare that to maybe even, as DARPA was involved in generating or producing the internet, it wasn't until the private sector ultimately got a hold of it and started taking advantage of it for commercial purposes that we actually leveraged it inside the military to where we could actually have an advantage. And if you look at satellite communication architecture, the systems exist in space now, and it seems to me that we're not taking advantage of it, and if we don't, our enemies possibly could. This, I think, represents a challenge that we have to face as it relates to the acquisition of access to a global communication architecture that already exists in space. My question for you is, as we go forward, will we get proposals from the Department of Defense to take advantage and leverage these assets that already exist and, of course, the rapid advancements in technology that are happening right now?
You make some very good points, and I think the short answer is yes. Because of concerns about survivability of our space assets, we are looking at a wide range of alternatives to the way we currently do business. We have a system called AEHF, which sounds like you're familiar with these, which is a very secure communication satellite. And we have to have satellite systems that provide communications that are secure against jamming, secure against cyber attack, and provide encrypted communications for us. And some of those do things like support the strategic deterrent. We also need to have fairly high bandwidth in order to support current operations in certain places. And we have leveraged commercial satellites to some degree, but we are re-looking now at our architectures because of the survivability problem that I talked about and that you mentioned, to see if disaggregated architectures of one type or another. And I think one of the things we do have to look at is whether we can effectively disaggregate by reliance more on commercial systems. We have to be sure that they're going to be available to us in wartime, that we'll have the capacity that we need. So there's some questions we have to answer there. And we have to look at their resiliency to various threats, not just a direct attack. But the short answer to your question is yes. And General Ramsey may want to comment on this because it's largely a requirements question.
I'll just piggyback on one word that Mr. Kendall mentioned, and it's a great issue to discuss further. And it's disaggregation. This has been a big topic in my 2.5 years in this job. Has been how do we look at space as a domain, and disaggregation could be doing things that we currently do in space by not doing it in space anymore. So we're looking at the whole soup to nuts. And as Mr. Kendall touched on, the big issue is there are certain things we have to do that are very protected, very secure, that may not have the bandwidth commercial satellites do, but we really are very much wedded to the commercial backbone, and I just see that increasing over time. But it's finding that right balance in the future.
I have about 20 seconds left. Just something to think about. Currently, when I talk to folks in the Pentagon, they talk about buying megahertz. They're talking about buying spectrum. And with spot beams and all the technologies that are advancing today, we need to start talking about, for the taxpayer as well as for the warfighter, we need to start talking about how do we purchase capacity, high throughput capacity, and putting it in terms of dollars per gigabits per second, if that makes sense.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for holding this hearing. Mr. Kendall and General Ramsey, thank you for your testimony, both today and this week. Very enlightening. I'd just like to, two questions. One, to see, are we making some improvements now? And I want to give the case study from an end-user perspective on the Crusader project as that came forward, and it felt like to me that there was very little input from the end-user side of things. The Crusader was 95, the howitzer piece, it was approved. You got the prototype in 98. We went down and we were starting to manufacture, and it was cut off in 2002 by the Secretary. Can that type of thing still happen today? I mean, does that happen in terms of the acquisition? Because from both in preparation from the fielding of that and the training from the end user artilleryman that was out there with that expectation and all the changes that went into play when that was canceled that far down the line, does that still happen?
It hasn't happened recently. I'm very familiar with the Crusader history. It's one of a number of programs that was started, and we spent quite a bit of money on it, then canceled it. Part of the legacy of Crusader was that it was a Cold War-oriented system at the time it was started. And the idea was to have a very efficient artillery piece that could be used in Europe more than anywhere else against the Soviets at the time. Because Cold War ended, the Army stuck with the program for a while. There were some technical issues, there were some cost issues. It was really a stretch. It was really a high-risk system, if you will. And it got into problems in development. Then it got into problems in affordability. And the Army came to a point after operations in Kosovo where the importance of deploying rapidly to a contingency really became dominant consideration in their requirements. And I think that had a lot to do
So the
with
inability
Crusader
to move
being
it.
canceled as well.
Yeah.
So I think if things change, and sometimes the threat changes so much, or the situations that you expect to face change so much, that you really do need to revisit prior decisions. And in some cases, it's appropriate to stop a program like that. But I think we need to be very careful.
It takes courage, though, to do that, right?
It does take courage to do that.
So they would, because I think history shows out it was probably the right thing. My question is, and just quickly as you see this, at what point does the end user come into that? And I say that because I think you're absolutely right. That was a transition from Cold War to a new one. We have a wealth of knowledge amongst war fighters that have been on the ground. Are we using that in terms of, is that fielding into the decision making?
I think it is, but I think you have to be careful because there's a tendency to think of the current fight or the most recent fight as the one you're always going to have to worry about. And I think at the current times, it's probably the opposite of that in some ways. The counterinsurgencies we've been fighting are probably not the model we should be most concerned about going forward. It's very hard for people to anticipate the next war. We're almost always wrong about that. Yeah. And it's important for a country like the United States to have general purpose forces that can do a lot of different things. And I mentioned earlier that right now, particularly with resources as tight as they are, that we really need to be very careful about our new starts and not start programs that aren't going to be the right program for us for some time to come.
Very good. I yield back. Thank you both.
Thank you. Mr. Walorski, there's, I think, 350 people who haven't voted yet, so if you'd like to go ahead, I think we've got time.
I think we have time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. My question is twofold. One is, I co-chair the working group here on electronic warfare, and knowing the comments that you made on Wednesday and the comments General Grinner has made before on the next large domain of our vulnerabilities. So my one question is, what can Congress do to help DOD streamline and bring attention and effectively address that electronic warfare problem? My second question quickly is, what about the issue of trust as we look at acquisition? You know, I represent the state of Indiana, a variety of different types of assets there, and the question I always get relative to this issue of acquisition reform is nobody trusts the Pentagon, and the lack of trust, no relationships, lack of trust, nobody believes anything on the side of the private industry or newer people trying to get in. Could you just address those two issues?
It's probably easier to address electronic warfare. We do have some shortfalls in electronic warfare. And the Defense Science Board did a study in this area recently and made a number of recommendations. And some of those we were able to take into account as we prepared our budget. Others we need to do additional study on. So that's an area that's getting a lot of attention right now. When I talked about what Russia and China are doing in particular, electronic warfare is a fundamental concern. And it's an area that, because of the types of threats we've been dealing with, we've not focused on nearly as much as we probably should have. As to trust, military is still one of the most trusted institutions in the country. So I'm a little surprised to hear you say that. Industry, and I have to tell my government counterparts this often because I've worked in industry quite a bit, is we need to appreciate that industry doesn't necessarily trust us in how we do business. And we need to be very transparent and clear in why we're doing things and how we're doing them. And I don't want to go into any examples, but I think we have to remind ourselves that trust can't be assumed. It has to be earned. And you do that by your behaviors, by being as transparent as you can about what you're doing and why you're doing it. Unfortunately, all of our source selection processes, which is where this often comes up as an issue, have to be protected because of the proprietary information involved and so on. So people get limited visibility into why someone was selected over someone else. I tell a story often that I don't think there's ever been a proposal manager who came back after he lost and told his boss that he lost because he wrote a bad proposal. They always come back and they say, I lost because they liked this other guy or because of some, something that's not, self-deprecatory.
Well, let me ask you this.
So I think
Do
you have to be
least-
careful about that, too.
Yeah, I understand. But do you at least agree that there has to be some, if we're really going to talk about how are we going to do this with this budget environment, with the vulnerabilities environments like that, I mean, do you at least agree that that issue with relationships and trust, something has to happen there, I think, in order for, I wouldn't be hearing it, and I'm one of the younger members of the team here, so that at least has to be addressed, and there has to be some kind of effort put forward where there is some kind of an atmosphere of trust?
Yeah, I agree, and we worked on our relationship with industry very hard. I was going to respond to the earlier question on that. We have reached out to industry. We take inputs from the industry associations and from individual firms. I'm very accessible to industry. My staff is very accessible. My manufacturing industrial base lead is very open to industry. And we have solicited inputs from industry for all the different versions of better buying power, and we've taken them into account, and they've affected what we've done. We've listened to industry on issues like lowest price technically acceptable, their concerns with that, commercial end items, so we are trying to respond to industry's concerns. At the end of the day, as somebody mentioned, there has to be an effective partnership with industry. We sit down and we try to negotiate the best business deals we can and protect the taxpayer's interest, but we also have to live in an environment where industry is motivated to come do work for us, where there's the reason for them to want to come work for the department besides just patriotism. And we need to be able to attract non-traditional firms to work with us, firms that for which there are some barriers to entry, if you will, into the marketplace for defense. So it gets a lot of attention, and we have to, again, strike the right balance there.
I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. It just seems to me that in addition to transparency, simplicity of the process with accountability for decisions go hand in hand with that and can help build added trust. And I know that's part of our mutual goal here. I think we're going to take a break. And again, we have 2 votes. Again, appreciate very much y'all's indulgence while we go do that. And we'll recess for the time being to reconvene after votes. Committee will come to order. Again, thank you all for your patience as we finish those votes. Ms. McSally, would you like to take time? Gentlelady's recognized for 5
Great,
minutes.
thank you, Mr. Kendall. Thanks, General Ramsey. It's good to see you again. We were just reminiscing about when I first met General Ramsey. I was a captain and he was a major, so it's great to see you continuing to serve in such a high capacity, and it's wonderful to be working with you. So I've got 2 questions. One is related to the development of follow-on aircraft. You know, as you may know, I flew the A-10 Warthog, and there's been a lot of discussion about the future of the A-10. But under the assumption that the A-10 sticks around for a little while longer, and if we could agree, maybe you won't agree with me, that the Joint Strike Fighter does not provide capabilities, and we decided we wanted to develop an AX of some port, like today. We decided we're going to develop an AX today. It needs to be a light attack aircraft to be able to do the things to protect our men and women in harm's way. What are we talking about timeline-wise? I mean, I want to just be able to frame the discussion. And I know it's hard because you don't know what the requirements are, but are we talking like 15 years, you know, to develop something where we haven't even identified it? And what could we do to speed that process up? And then the second question is related to, you mentioned the constraints of sequestration, but also when we are spending money based on the end of the fiscal year, use it or lose it. Even though we've had deep cuts, and I've seen them in the military, that's also a very inefficient way to do business. And even last year, I know friends still in uniform, and I know friends who are contractors now, they were still on a spending spree of sorts in the last week in September, you know, with the money. So what can we do to address that? Because, I mean, we're under very difficult financial, you know, resource limitations right now, but we're still on a spending spree at the end of the fiscal year. So what can we do to help fix that culture and that dynamic?
I'm going to let General Ramsey address the next light attack aircraft that we're going to buy, which I don't think we have one of those in the budget at the moment. But the issue of use or lose it, it's a real issue. And it was what I was getting at earlier about not putting our people in a position where time is working against them and they have to spend money or they feel pressure to spend money. We've looked at that, and it tends to happen in the O&M side of the house where money expires every year. And it also tends to happen where people are buying things like office products and so on, where people will stock up at the end of the year. And I don't know, I don't have good data on the magnitude of that abuse. Or I consider it an abuse if we're buying things we don't need.
Yeah, there's also service contracts and things.
I tell the story about when I was a lieutenant in the Army, we'd fire ammo off at the end of the year so we get the same amount of ammo next year. I've had fighter pilots talk to me about going out and burning holes in the sky just to use up gas because they wouldn't get the, you know, the O&M money for training next year, even though it wasn't a useful use of the resource. I think that is a problem. And the Defense Business Board talked about how the Defense Department tends to be a culture of spending as opposed to a culture of cost control. That's one of the fundamental things we've been trying to get after in the whole set of better buying power initiatives. We try to force our managers to address cost control as a fundamental mission and to track their cost, understand their costs, and try to beat them down, and to free up resources for things we really need. So if we do have end-of-year money and we can repurpose it, it needs to go to things we really need and not just be spent because it's there to be spent. And I'll let you address the next generation.
Congresswoman McSally, well, that sounds good. Would you go back to a press conference we talked about in 1993, but it's great to see you again, and congratulations. Obviously, the A-10 subject has been discussed a lot with Congress, but also in the building. And I'm not going to repeat all the things that my Air Force has said, but I'll just say it.
Yeah, I just don't even want to get into that.
Yeah.
It's just more, if we're going to develop something else, what does that look like?
Let me kind of tie it into the Aerospace Innovation Initiative that Mr. Kendall hit on earlier. We're looking at this, you know, one of the things that JSIDS does is we're not looking at specific mission areas, we're looking at domains and how are we going to fight the future fight. So part of the A-10 issue, besides the fact that it's an aging aircraft, is what is right for the high-end fight of the future. So as you well know, we're looking at this from a multitude of angles. The permissive environment, the huge dearth of weapons system that this committee has supported us buying over the last 10 years that allow us to do some pretty remarkable things and maintaining the technological edge to do that. The short answer to your question is, if we started today, and I'll really defer to Mr. Kendall on time, we're probably talking about 15 years for a full developmental program. There are some low-end things out there that other nations are buying we could do much faster, but we don't think that's the right thing for us for the high-end fight of the future.
Yeah, thanks. That's really what I was getting at. I didn't want to get into the politics of it all, but start to finish if we decided. And thanks so much for 15 years is a good, that's what I figured it would be, but I wanted to make sure that that was my understanding. So part of the dialogue we have for the future
If we
capabilities.
built a low-end light attack, we could do that very quickly. There are off-the-shelf possibilities for that. I mean, Textron's done a system on their own money, which could possibly fulfill that need. We've done a propeller-driven light attack we're giving to the Afghanistans, and there are planes around the world we could look at modifying and using. If that were the only purpose for the aircraft, we could do it pretty quickly, I think. The problem is if we want something that's going to give us air dominance for another generation,
Right.
that's a very, very different program. That is a 10-year program.
Great, thanks, and my time's expired. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I share the concerns about the loss of the A-10, especially as far out from the basing of the F-35s. That's, I think, my primary concern. I understand it's an aging system. I would sure feel better about standing the A-10 down if we were closer to the basing of the F-35. And as we talk about acquisition reform, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is life cycle cost and sustainment, and that ends up being about 2/3 of the cost of the system, and it kind of gets overlooked, if you will, in the press and other areas. But I represent Robins Air Force Base, one of the 3 depots, and I'd just like you to, if you would, speak to additional reforms in the acquisition process from the standpoint of sustainment planning, total life cycle cost, and how our organic capabilities play into those areas, as well as the ability to ramp up, if you will, when we need to.
I think we've probably got about the right balance of depot and contracted support. And it's something that I think has been stable for many, many years now. We're trying to improve the efficiency of both the depots and of contracted support. One of the better buying power sets of initiatives that you have in front of you is in the area of contracted services, including maintenance. And we're also trying to invoke performance-based logistics as a way to incentivize industry, or depots for that matter, to do a better job. It's a little harder in the government structure than it is with industry to do that sort of thing. But both have their role, and one of the important roles of depots is their surge capability in case it's needed. Increasingly, as we have an aging force, the depots are needed for overhaul and upgrades of our system. So I think we've got the balance about right. We are focused on sustainment. As you mentioned, it's something on the order of 50 to 70% of our life cycle cost of a program are in the sustainment phase as opposed to the R&D or the production phases. And we really have to go after that much more carefully than we have. The development phase overruns tend to get all the public attention, but that's not where the money is. We really need to look where the money is and try to drive cost out there.
General? Yeah.
If I can just add very quickly, one of the things that that Congress has directed us to do based on our request is very, very, very early in the requirements process, as we begin to have a conversation about a gap with our acquisition professionals and look for resources, we do an analysis of alternatives that really gets at the life cycle cost. So we're trying to find out the knee in the curve and what the life cycle cost is going to be from the moment we start bending metal until something goes to the boneyard, if you will, and look at that from head to toe.
Do you foresee Air Force depots competing for business from other branches in the future? Do you foresee us, if you will, allowing that work to transfer from Army to Air Force, or move more work?
I would like to have the flexibility to do that sort of thing. And I'm speaking totally off the cuff right now, but I would like to have, frankly, more public-private competition than we're allowed to have right now. Competition is terrific. It drives out costs more effectively than anything else. And I think having competition among the services, even for service organizations, to do work like that would probably be healthy for us. I'm not sure that everybody would be happy about that, but I think it would be healthy in terms of driving out costs.
Thank you. I'll yield the remainder of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Ms. Stefanik?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Kendall and General Ramsey, for your testimony today. My question relates to clarifying the chain of command in the acquisition decision-making process. What steps are you currently taking to clarify both authorities and improve the accountability of the decision-makers within and throughout the chain of command?
The chain of command for acquisition is pretty straightforward. For major programs, it runs from me through the service acquisition executive to the program executive officer to the program manager. And I try to emphasize that. It's one of the principles that we've pushed in all the Better Buying Power initiatives. We try to set up this is relatively new, but we try to set up our program managers' tenures so that they come into a program before you start up phase, and then their responsibility, once they've gotten approval to do their plan for that phase, is to execute that plan. So success is about successful execution of a plan that you submitted as opposed to getting something approved. I try to hold our program managers and program executive officers accountable by recording their names on all of my decision documents as the people who brought the plan forward for approval that I'm approving, so that there's a permanent record of that. We occasionally have to remove someone who's not performing effectively, and we've done that. We don't usually do it with a lot of fanfare. These are often people who've had fairly successful careers working in the military, and we're not trying to embarrass them, but we're trying to replace them with somebody who's going to be more effective in that particular role. So I think we do some things. I think what we have to work against to some extent is all the stakeholders in our acquisitions programs who have a voice and often are senior in rank to the people involved in the actual management of the programs. And that can sometimes be a problem for us.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Langevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimony here today. Mr. Chairman, you and I have had a long history of working together on these important issues. So I really appreciate this hearing and your continued attention to such an important national security matter. General Ramsey, if I could start with you, I'd like to learn a little more about the interplay that drives the JSIDS process. And as you and your staff work through future battle space scenarios and determine what's needed, how do you determine what technologies will be mature enough for inclusion in those discussions? And could you elaborate as to how you draw in the subject matter experts to staff the functional capability boards? And how do you ensure that they're able to have full visibility across the research and development enterprise with an appropriate appreciation for technological maturity levels? And similarly, how do your discussions feed into the concept of operations discussions that are in many ways just as critical? I know I've thrown a lot out you there, but if you could help me by answering those questions.
Well, thank you, Congressman. And I got to spend a year in Rhode Island and loved every minute of it at Naval War College. So I'll open my comments sort of as a naval term, as an Air Force officer.
Please come back and visit us again soon.
I will, and I know you're digging out from a big snowstorm from the last 2 days. It's an all hands on deck, I guess, is the best way I can talk about the process in a couple of the areas that you mentioned. The JSIDS process that we have statutorily and then by our own volition evolved to over the last 6 years. I mentioned earlier that we now have certified requirements professionals that work within it. If you want to be in the requirements business in the department, you have to be certified by Defense Acquisition University, just like our great acquisition professional corps. The second piece of this is it is a completely transparent, collaborative, intertwined process. So when you look at the three big pillars of how we do the department's business, resourcing, requirements, and acquisition, those bubbles all interact and everybody plays in the pool. So I'm a key figure, for example, in all three areas. So is the Vice Chairman, so is Mr. Kendall, who run the Defense Acquisition Board, and the Vice Chairman runs the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. He's the chair of that. We, as I said early on, we work with the acquisition community, with the intel community. Intel has the most play in developing the concept of operations. What's the future fight going to look like? Then we work with the war fighters, especially the combatant commanders, about how they would like us to look at addressing that. That leads us into the technological piece that you mentioned, and that's where our acquisition professionals come in. That's where DARPA comes in. That's where things that Mr. Kendall is working to reach out to industry to find out, simply stated, what is the state of technological maturity across the board in the world today to bring that into defense. Some things we know about and some things we don't. So if I can use one word to kind of capture all this, it's intertwined. We are all linked at the hip from the very beginning of I have a problem to I need a solution, and we work this together as teams across resources, requirements, and acquisition.
So let me ask this: how do concerns about industrial base in niche capabilities, where we're relying heavily on industry R&D dollars, such as directed energy, fit into your decision making? And also, you briefly mentioned electronic warfare in your testimony, Mr. Kendall. How do we compare in that capability with our adversaries, and what would you need to be done to improve upon it?
I think the simple answer on electronic warfare is we've neglected that area for some time because we haven't been able to respond to some of the things that threats are doing. I think we're behind right now. We're playing catch up to some degree on that. We have some programs underway, the Next Generation Jammer, for example, in the Navy. I'd like to see those things accelerated where we can. Again, we just had a good Defense Science Board study on this, gave us a lot of recommendations. Some of those have influenced our budget. Others are under further study and will probably influence next year's budget. So I think that's an area where I think we need to focus a lot more attention going forward than we have in the past.
Do you want to add anything, General?
Yes, sir. Just very quickly, one of the things that you mentioned this, and that's one reason I want to touch upon it, is one of the things that we're very cognizant of is as we work through our concept of operations is just what is out there for us to be able to do. And the industrial base is certainly something we watch, but really Mr. Kendall and his team are the experts. And obviously, as the budget has come down the last 5 years, we're very mindful of those industries out there that we cannot lose. And I'd like kind of Mr. Kendall to piggyback on that, if you would.
Yeah, we cut R&D spending from a peak of over $80 billion to about $65 billion, $63 billion. That's a pretty dramatic drawdown. And I think of that, frankly, as letting the engineers that are part of our force structure go. A lot of them go. And when those people leave defense industry, they're probably not coming back. And we consciously look at this every year as we go through the budget process. We have the Deputy Secretary chairs a meeting where he looks at the health of industry consciously to make sure we're not doing anything there that's going to do irreparable harm. And we have, I think, over the last few years, in each case, made some adjustments in our budget because of industrial-based concerns. That said, at the end of the day, the resources are what they are. And if you're going to cut the amount of funding in R&D by a large amount of money, then you are going to cut a large amount of your capacity to do that kind of work. And you'd have to rebuild that. I mentioned the Aerospace Innovation Initiative earlier. One of the reasons I'm doing that, the one reason the department's doing that, is to preserve the design teams that can give us the next generation of capability in that area. As once those design teams go away, we've lost them. And it's very hard to get them back. In very specialized areas, like you mentioned, electronic warfare, that's a very special skill set. And you can't develop somebody who's an expert at that overnight. It takes time. Yeah. And you get that expertise by working on programs, by developing new cutting-edge things.
Yeah. And I know my time's expired, but that I share that concern, and I've heard directly from industry that given the significant drawdown in R&D, that they're struggling to survive in many fields, and they're making business decisions right now that they're basically, anyways, may be forced to close the doors if the R&D funding isn't there to continue to keep the pipeline alive. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. I have some other questions for the record that I'd like to submit. It'd be helpful if you could provide some answers. Thank you.
No, I appreciate the gentleman raising that issue. I think some of the most difficult challenges we face are to what extent we continue to fund, say, a supply line just to keep the industrial base engaged, even if we don't necessarily need at that moment what they produce. And you mentioned the R&D, losing the engineers. I think it's together. Those are some of the most difficult challenges we have before us. I want to get back actually to part of what Mr. Langevin was asking about at the beginning, and then other members have asked about as well, General, on the requirements system. I mean, you've described, the way it's supposed to work and all the interactions and so forth. And yet, as was pointed out earlier, one of the suggestions we've heard from some of our conversations with acquisition people is we need to take the time up front to really investigate the technology, understand what we're dealing with. That helps procurements go quicker. One hears always that part of what happens with programs that don't perform well is requirements creep, that, you know, it changes over time and so forth. So my question is, especially from the military standpoint, how do we have the discipline in the system to invest the extra time up front, to not have the requirements creep when you know, there's the demands to get it there now. You know, I know there's the JROC, lots of committees, you know, discuss this, but really when it boils down to where's the discipline in the system to do what has been suggested?
Chairman, those are both great questions, both great issues. The process that we've laid in place, again, thanks to your help in the last 4 years, I think really has put us on the path to getting at the discipline up front. More and more of our programs are really broken up, torn apart, and built back up long before we ever, as I said earlier, getting into the business of bending metal. In terms of requirement creep, I would offer there's sort of two ways, there's two different paths in that. One of them is there is requirements creep that is caused sometimes by the assessment of what the future warfights are going to be, because it takes a while to get these weapon systems through the development process into production, and the world changes. And we have critical intelligence breaches. So in some cases, we have to evolve the requirement because we don't want to field a weapon system to fill a capability gap where the gap, the weapon system is not going to serve the needs of the future. But there's another side of that, which I would offer we've had a lot of success at, again, thanks to your committee, which is we are asking program managers and sponsors, namely the services and the combatant commands, that when possible, if they find out that a weapon system needs to have its performance parameters reduced because we are way beyond the knee in the curve in the cost. In other words, we can deliver something that is a little bit less capable, but at much less cost that still meets the warfighter's needs. We are getting really good at that. So Admiral Winnefeld and Mr. Kendall sent a memo out about 2 years ago which encouraged, for the first time, sponsors and program managers to bring requirements back to the process. So we have de-scoped a lot of programs to get at that, to find that knee in the curve in terms of life cycle cost, delivering things that actually the warfighters need today. We can get them there quicker and we can do it a lot cheaper. So we're kind of watching both sides of that. The intelligence piece I mentioned a minute ago is something rather new, and it gets back to the pace of technological change of some of our adversaries, that we have to take a step back and go, we need to rethink this, and probably, we can call it requirements creep, but it's really about meeting the needs of the future. So we're looking at both sides of the coin, if you will.
No, and I appreciate you raising that, because that's a very fair point. If there are leaks, for example, that disclose key technologies, then we've got to deal with that situation. We can't stick our heads in, stick our heads in the sand. But I'll just say, you know, part of what I think this committee needs to do is to help provide some of that discipline too. When the budget requests come before us, we need to ask those questions, and maybe we can reinforce some of the efforts that you're talking about over the last 3 or 4 years. Mr. Kendall, another issue that people talk about quite a bit is, and you mentioned it earlier, prototyping and experimentation. And one way it's been described is you get into a catch-22. If you don't have a requirements for something, then there's really no place to go with it, even if you've got a great idea. And yet, if you can't at least move a great idea some distance down the process, you can't ever do anything with it. It just kind of languishes there. Some people have even suggested maybe we need to look at a prototype experimentation fund, expanded fund that you would have, and let the services compete for dollars or for ideas that they could flesh out. I guess kind of in a general way, are there things that we could do together to help ideas or to learn from them, to have an increased level of prototyping and experimentation?
We do a good degree of that now.
Right.
And we're relatively free in the science and technology part of our activities to do that without formal requirements, which is a good way to do it. We have a program that isn't all that large now in the budget. It used to be larger. It's called Joint Capability Technology Demonstration Programs, which has done a number of usually small programs and historically did larger ones. And we're kind of moving slowly back towards more significant demonstrations there. The Aerospace Innovation Initiative that I talked about is a fairly large-scale demonstration program, prototyping program, without a firm requirement. It's going to explore the possible, basically, and it'll allow us to have people who set requirements make much better informed decisions as we go down the road and understand what the art of the possible really is. So we do have some things. We also have foreign comparative tests, which allow us to look at foreign systems and see how they might fit into our things on somewhat of an experimental basis. Be willing to have a dialogue with you about whether there's an adequate number of resources in that area or not. It's a hard area when budgets are tight to peel out resources from other things that are being shortchanged already to do things which aren't definitely going to lead to a fielded product. But it's an important thing for us to do, at least to some degree.
Okay. Yeah.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to mention something because I think it's important. I'd call at least to your attention. I've left with the committee a report that was done by Institute for Defense Analysis, and it has to do with the subject of tight budgets and not tight budgets. It's one of the most, I think, profound pieces of work, important pieces of work, trying to analyze cause and effect and correlations in our acquisition system over decades. And what this analysis, which was done by the former head of the CAIG and Cost Analysis Independent Group in what is now CAPE, looked at major programs and the cost growth in those major programs over several decades and correlated that with two things. One was acquisition policy, and the other was whether budgets are tight or loose. There was no correlation to the acquisition policy changes. Nothing we did seemed to make any difference in the performance of programs. Tight budgets and loose budgets had a major impact, and the numbers are pretty shocking. In periods in which budgets are relatively loose and people can manage with some degree of cushion, if you will, in their planning, our overruns and production costs are on the order of 10%. When budgets are tight, they're on the order of 30%. It makes a huge difference. And I thought this was one of the more profound things I've seen. I wanted to call it to your attention. We are in a tight budget era now. And what this is telling me is that behaviors change in a way which leads to major cost overruns when we're in tight budgets. And we can talk about what those might be. One of them is trying to hang on to things we really can't afford with the budgets that we have and cram more into the budget than it will really support and pretend for whatever reason that costs are going to be lower than they're actually going to be. And frankly, I've seen some evidence of that sort of thing. Industry is hungrier in times like this, and it'll talk itself into bidding more aggressively in order to win the business because it's all the business there is to compete for. So there are a number of things that may come together to cause this impact. But I wanted to point it out to the chairman because as we've looked for ways to improve defense acquisition, this is not one of the things we have focused on. We've looked at a lot of other things, but this has an impact that is far beyond any of the other things we've done, and I think it's important to note that.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning it. I have not had a chance to read the study yet, although I did see a summary of it, and like you, I start thinking about, okay, what are the reasons for that? What are the behaviors? And maybe one of them is just what we were talking about. There is, with tight budgets, it is harder to put the resources in up front to get the requirements and the prototyping done, so in effect, it takes more money and more time because you don't put that initial investment into it.
Another impact is that we tend to stretch out programs. We stretch out the development program. And Crusader was mentioned. Comanche is another example of this, where programs, because of resource constraints, were stretched out in development for years and years and years. And I'm not quite sure exactly how that impacts unit cost. Part of it is that technologies are changing, so you have to redesign for them, and you end up with more costly technologies. Another part is whether you can hold your design team together throughout, or you end up making changes because of that as people change on the design teams. I think there are a number of things there we'd have to look at more deeply, but I think it's a very important result nevertheless.
Okay, good point, and we will join you in looking and trying to understand that result. I guess the last question I have is I want to get back to the legislative proposals that you submitted. I'm sure you have run into a lot of the same reactions that I have when talk about improving the acquisition system. It's a little bit of eye rolling, and oh, I've heard that story before. And there is some skepticism, concern that y'all are just going to do something that looks like you're doing something, but it doesn't really matter. So my bottom line question to you is the legislative proposals that you have offered us, we're going to have to take time to look at them carefully, but if they were enacted, would it matter? Would it significantly help the current situation?
The answer is yes. And the reason that the answer is yes is that it would give our managers back their most precious, it would give our managers back their most precious asset, which is time. If we can remove bureaucratic burdens on our program managers so they can focus on the things that really matter, they will get better performance for us. And I think in general, I use the term acquisition improvement as opposed to acquisition reform, because to me, reform implies that there's some big thing we can do which is going to make a huge difference. I don't think that's the case. I think what we have to do is attack our problems on many fronts and make incremental progress on many fronts. Learn from our experience and then adopt new things as we understand the impact of the things we've done. And that's why we've emphasized a continuous process improvement approach in the Better Buying Power initiatives over the last several years. And I think that's the right approach. I think we will make incremental progress on a lot of fronts. In the aggregate, I think it's going to make a big difference. But you have to be willing to attack on the details on a lot of different aspects of acquisition. At the end of the day, a great deal of it is about not putting rules in place or that constrain people, but getting people in a position where they can make better decisions and do the right thing, and then have the institutional support to execute the right thing and do it successfully.
Okay. Well, I completely agree. There are no magic bullets here. It does require continuous effort, and so I will try to use the term acquisition improvement as well and follow your lead. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the extra time. So I just had a couple of subject areas I wanted to touch on, and in some ways you've touched on them already, but maybe to focus them a little more. With a technology like directed energy or a family of systems like unmanned undersea vehicles, there are so many variables that affect the demand signal for its development and deployment. Things like amount and level of R&D funding, the CONOPS, platform availability, specific characteristics of the weapons systems and adversary systems, familiarity of the service with the capabilities in question, and the creation of a demand signal, affordability of various options, and so on. So could you walk us through a little further how those feedback loops work, and how does your staff make the decision to turn one dial versus another, and how does intelligence, and I know you've touched on that already, but how does intelligence about potential adversaries feed into that?
That's a great question. And I think at the heart of it is our ability to do something different when it's the right thing to do or not. What we're good at, I think, in the department is buying the next generation of the thing that we already have. The next generation fighter plane, the next generation armored vehicle, the next generation surface combatant, whatever. What we're not so good at is recognizing when we have to fundamentally change direction. Now, if you look at the offset strategies that Secretary Work talks about, one is use of tactical nuclear weapons in the 50s, which was made available because of the fact nuclear weapons have been developed. We were in a situation where we were looking at very large-scale forces on the Soviet side, and we needed something to counter that, and it was sort of an obvious thing that we could do. The precision weapons offset strategy that started in the 70s and we really demonstrated in the 90s was such an obvious improvement in efficiency on the battlefield. That was sort of an easy one to do. Directed energy is one that we've talked about forever, but we've never been able to get the technology quite to where it's kind of over that hurdle of being operationally useful enough. The Navy is doing a demonstration project right now with a laser on a ship, which is getting up closer to an operational capability, but is not really where you'd quite like to be. So those are technologies that move forward very incrementally over time, but haven't quite gotten to where we're ready. I think in the case of directed energy, if the performance was there, the utility of that is so obvious, if you can really do it effectively, then that it's easy to embrace that. Another one that's similar is railguns, electromagnetic launch railguns, which we've been working on for decades also. And if you could get that technology, which has advanced quite a bit. One of the problems I mentioned earlier was defensive air bases, for example, or defensive ships, high-value assets. If you can get to a one-shot, one-kill capability there through either of those two means, that's a huge improvement in capability. And I think it's one that's fairly obvious to see. Others, the use of unmanned systems in undersea environment you talked about, I think we have to think more carefully about what the ops concept is and how we would use them, and think about the operation end to end. So it's not as obvious what you would do or how you would use that technology if you got there. And we have an effort going on now in the department called the Long Range Research and Development Planning Program, which is being led by our chief system engineer. It mirrors a study that was done in the 70s with a similar name that led to the investments that gave us the precision munitions and the other things that we used in the so-called second offset strategy. And one of the things that that team that's working now is trying to do is identify the things we should be investing in that would make a big difference on the battlefield of the future, and perhaps identify a third offset strategy that we could work our way towards. It isn't quite, to me at least, it isn't quite as clear a path as some of the earlier two that I mentioned were. And I'd also point out that all offset strategies are not successful. The Germans attempted an offset strategy with submarines in World War II, which came close, but it didn't actually prevail at the time. Any real innovation in military operational capability tends to be some form of an offset strategy. And getting it right, once you embrace that, is important. Now, it's easier to do things where you can integrate the new capability into the way you already do business. So in the case of railguns or electromagnetic launch or directed energy, I already do air defense systems, so it's a different kind of an air defense system, if you will. Other capabilities, such as some of the disaggregated we talked about earlier, require you to completely stop what you're doing and do something different. Those are the hard decisions for the department to make. I think they're hard for any military institution to make. And identifying them and having the courage to go forward, I think is something that we're going to be challenged by.
I completely agree with Mr. Kendall's comments. I would just offer, I think one term that Mr. Kendall didn't use that we talk about a lot is we're looking at if you look at our budgets in the last 3 or 4 years as they have gone down, frankly, we're struggling with this balance of the fight tonight and what's good enough for now versus investing in the future. And part of investing in the future is where are the game changers. And that's this third technological offset strategy. That really has dominated our conversations across the department, but especially in the resourcing and requirements and acquisition world, looking for those game changers. That's part of what LRDPP does in the whole innovation initiative, and that is again, all hands on deck process right now.
Well, I just hope that when the game-changing technology does come on to see and it's mature enough, that we don't have this institutional resistance to then being able to adopt it, wanting to hold on to legacy systems. Directed energy is a particular concern of mine. That when it's there, are we going to be able to adopt it quick enough? Mr. Secretary, you're a bit maybe more optimistic than I would be when you talk about the utility of it is so obvious. But I also get concerned about the institutional resistance to adopting new technologies quickly when we're so used to the missiles or things like phalanx that would be used as the kind of kinetic defenses that lasers could be much more effective at once we employ them. But I understand that technology does have a little ways to go still. But last thing I had, do you believe that the current procurement process is so long that the technology becomes obsolete by the time it reaches the warfighter? And how do we avoid these issues in areas such as cyber, where procurement timelines are so mismatched with budget timelines?
Yeah, we understand that, well, first of all, when we do a very complicated weapon system, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some time to do the design and then to do all the testing of all the features associated with that system. And during that time, some technologies are going to move forward, and the threats are going to move forward. So you have to build into your design through what we call modular designs or through open systems architectures, the ability to do upgrades to that initial system as you go along. And sometimes to make changes in progress if the threat dictates that. If you look at, I'm going to use the F-35 as an example. We've gone through a series of technology insertions on the X-35 already in terms of processing capability. There are probably more of those in the future. We have asked for, and we had some difficulty with the Congress on this, but I think we've worked our way past that, funds to start the follow-on development for the electronic protection systems, for example, that we're going to need in the future after the initial fielding of the full capability. So you have to design in the flexibility and the process and then secure the funding in a phased way to improve your products over time and to take account for the fact that technologies and threats are both going to be changing as you're going through the product life cycle.
Very good. Well, thank you both for your testimony and your patience. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the extra time, and I yield back.
No, I appreciate the gentleman's questions and the issues he raises. Thank you both for being here, Mr. Kendall. As we work our way through the proposals that you have made, as we discuss with you ideas that we have and from others, I hope we can keep this as a continuous process, as you described. So another package maybe next year, and another one the year after that, and another one the year after that, because it's going to take that continued persistence to get at the many complex issues that you raise. That's certainly going to be a priority of this committee, and I appreciate the time and effort and the cooperation that you and your folks have put into it so far. So I look forward to that.
Thank you, sir. Same here.
Yeah. Again, thank you all for being here. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.